If you have your Bibles, let's go ahead and turn to Numbers chapter 21. Numbers 21. Perhaps this chapter is the chapter in the entire book of Numbers that all students of the Bible are familiar with. And in particular, due to the event of the raising up of the brazen or brass serpent in the wilderness and its relationship to Jesus. And we're going to talk more about this in the sermon this morning, and we're going to touch a little bit upon it in the lesson today here in class. But I suggest in a study of this chapter, when you look at the entire chapter, when you look at the first section of it, there's a lot more going on in this chapter than this one particular incident in which we're going to be discussing. And I believe that a study of this chapter will show once again to us that as God's people, are we immune from problems? We talked about this last week. So no, we're not immune from problems. And again, this chapter is going to open up with Israel facing yet another problem. And so I think in this section, we're going to see that sometimes in order for us to go forward in our lives as God's people, sometimes we have to go backward. And that's not in the sense of turning back to the past manner of life, but rather in finding different ways around or through difficult situations in life. But the most dangerous thing, however, is just simply getting stuck in neutral, not going any place. Because sometimes we may have to stop, back up, reassess things, and then proceed. However, as we're also going to discuss, this section will also illustrate the problem yet again, and we've seen this time and again throughout the book of Numbers, have we not, of God's people walking by sight rather than by faith. And we know how God feels about such behavior. It angers him. And certainly this section shows once again the tragedy and futility of refusing to trust God and to simply walk by faith rather than by sight. So with these thoughts in mind, let's begin by reading verse number 1 of Numbers chapter 21. And let's begin by looking at the problem that is presented to Israel at this juncture. If someone would, read verse 1.
The king of Arad, the Canaanite, who dwelt in the south, heard that Israel was coming on the road to Ephraim. Then he fought against Israel and took some of them prisoners.
Thank you, Sister Cindy. Now, again, you go back to last week, and by way of review, how did Moses want to lead Israel? What was his planned course toward Canaan last week? How had he originally intended for Israel to travel? Through Edom, exactly, through the Edomite territory. However, what happened? Edom refused, blocked passageway, exactly right. And so we noted last week that Israel turned back southward to the western side of Edom to go around its southern border. In other words, they had to go back in order to go forward. And they had to travel then northward along its northeastern borders. And again, there they came to Mount Hor, where Aaron died, and Eleazar, as we discussed last week, ascended to the position of high priest. Now from Mount Hor, they traveled to the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, where they could avoid Edomite territory. And as Israel made the turn from the Gulf to travel toward the southern edge of the land of Canaan, Arad, one of the Canaanite kings who dwelt in the south, heard Israel was approaching by the same path the spies took, really almost 40 years earlier, and resolved to go out against Israel. And what happened here? What is the difficulty that Israel is facing here with the Canaanites? Well, they went to combat, and what was the result? There were some Israelites captured, exactly right, Brother Ricky. And now, took some of them prisoners. In the King James Version, the word some is italicized. That means it was supplied by the translators, not in the original. Literally, it reads, took of them prisoners. Now, to the number who were taken, we cannot know other than the fact that some of the Israelites had been captured. We might say they were POWs, I guess you might call them. And so, here we have another crisis that Israel had to deal with in their forward march toward the promised land. Now, I find it ironic. I find it interesting as we progress now, as we get ready to read verses 2 and 3. I find it amazing how they react to this crisis. And they react correctly. But then I find it even more mind-boggling what's going to happen after this particular incident. Let's look at verses 2 and 3, if someone would read those.
And Israel vowed a vow unto the Lord and said, If thou wilt indeed deliver this people into my hand, then I will utterly destroy their cities. And the Lord hearkened to the words of Israel, and delivered up the Canaanites, and they utterly destroyed them and their cities, and he called the name of the place Hormah.
All right, thank you, Sister Dusty. Now, as we think about this, Israel indeed faced a crisis. They faced the crisis of having to deal with some of the inhabitants of the land who wanted to treat them harshly. And they also had to deal with the crisis that some of their fellow countrymen had been captured. Now, how do they react to this crisis? To whom do they turn? They turn to God. Correctly so. And so here we see them making their petition. They recognize their difficulty. And so they vow a vow. And they promise God that if he delivered them, they, that is Israel, would destroy completely the inhabitants and devote the cities and spoils to God. And so here, with their behavior here, how are they behaving here? What is the manifest? What is their attitude here toward God? What it should have been, exactly. Faith. And they wanted deliverance. But again, this is how they should have been behaving the entire time, is it not? When faced with a difficult situation, they should have been crying to God. Yeah, like they do here. They cry to God here. And notice verse 3. He hearkened to the voice of Israel. And again, the application toward prayer here for us today is that God heard their prayers and answered it. He answered it positively here. So, as Christians today, from this verse, what do we learn about prayer? Or what should that teach us?
We can't go on 5 steps alone.
No.
That's what it teaches.
Yeah, Jeremiah 10:23. So we need to lean up.
That's what the people, leaders of this world, they feel recognize.
Mm-hmm.
They may recognize it, but they don't adhere to it.
That we cannot find our way alone. We need God. And, prayer shows our dependence upon God, does it not?
Prayer works.
Prayer works. Effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, as James puts it.
But you gotta believe it's gonna work.
Exactly. And even Christ said in teaching about prayer that you pray in faith without doubting. Think about the Sermon on the Mount. If you keep ask, seek, and knock. Ask and, door will be open unto you. But we have to keep on asking, we have to keep on seeking, and we have to keep on knocking, do we not? Many times, there's many valuable parables even given by Christ teaching the need to persist in prayer. The parable of the unjust judge and the persistent widow, the parable of the friend at midnight. As Christians, we need to keep on praying. And Paul said, pray without ceasing, did he not? So prayer works. We just have to believe it works. And that's where faith comes in, does it not?
I think God here took action on them.
He did.
They had every reason not to. They had given him every reason.
He did, but
Chastised.
But again, you would think, I would suggest Sister Nana here as well, that he was would we say that God was pleased by this request of Israel? That they would would we say that God was pleased by the fact that Israel here cried out unto him?
I don't think God will.
No, I think it showed compassion because they had called on him, he had helped them, and then they went right back where they were.
Yep.
And that is why,
So we're the same way today, we do that hand wringing and whatever when things aren't going great. But if we face an immediate danger,
Yeah.
then we run to God immediately. We know go to God. But with just the everyday things aren't going well,
Mm-hmm.
it's rough, then we just wring our hands and we blame somebody else instead of going like
Mhm.
Cindy said, just go on to God and ask.
Exactly, Sister Roberta. If we trust in God completely, when we face the rough days of life and the rough difficulties of life, we won't be wringing our hands. We'll just say, hey, with God on my side, I can get through it. Brother Carl?
I know people don't agree with me on this, but I believe God answers. And I think I've found the scripture to back this up. He does answer prayer to a sinner. Now, I was not a Christian when I was no more, but I prayed to God every day to bring me back to my family, America, safely. And I think He heard my prayers. I've always been raised to go to church and stuff like since I was an infant, I guess. But I still believe.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they've been answering prayers of people back here,
amen,
Christians that were asking.
amen.
They're asking for him to come back.
But that was one year I hated my life. I don't see how if we, well, he still has compassion even on sinners, I think.
He does. Well, you think about Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, before he became a Christian. Well, we're told he was a very sincere man, and he prayed, but, and God sent him what he needed. He sent him a preacher. And Peter preached the gospel to them, and what happened? They obeyed the gospel and were saved. So we have that example there. God will, reward those who diligently seek Him.
He knows your heart.
He provides a way. And again, providence. I'm going to come back to that tonight. Providence of God. God provides a way. We don't, again, so much we don't know about it. There's so much we can know about it to an extent. God provided Cornelius and his household with what they needed. The gospel and the preacher. God sent the preacher unto him. And we see the results there. And, you could say, Brother Carl, providence. God provided you a way home. And you see what happened. And you see what happened after you returned home. God, we sing the song, I know the Lord will find a way for me. We just have to believe, we just have to have faith, we just have to trust that God is and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. And we have to act on our faith, obviously. And I think we see the power of prayer here as it relates to Israel and God. Now, sadly, that the reliance they demonstrated upon here, which enabled them to keep going, didn't last long. Let's look at verses 4 and 5 and look now at their prattling. If someone would, read these two verses for us.
Then they journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom. And so the people became so discouraged on their way. And the people spoke against God and against Moses. Why have you brought us out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food, no water. Our souls long for the wilderness bread.
Thank you, Brother Carl. Oh, here we go again. Here we go again. Where have we seen this? Where have we seen this song and dance before? The whole trip. Oh, man. And you know what's sad? This is the same thing they complained about time and again, is it not?
Well, I thought it was funny. Most of these people were young when they left Egypt. They didn't have that much. They wandered in the wilderness 40 years.
Yeah.
So they had heard this all this time.
They had heard it.
Over and over.
And I guess, they learned the habits from their parents or their ancestors. There's no doubt that the route they took was long and arduous. Now, and we understand why it was, because Edom forbade them from taking the quicker way. And the way of the Red Sea here is described in Deuteronomy 7, verse 15, as that great and terrible wilderness. And again, we understand why they had to go this way, because of their enemies.
You reckon if they'd asked God like he asked them here about the Canaanites and to let them go through Edom, that he would have prayed that?
Perhaps.
There's no praying.
But again, no praying. And that's a good, I'll say perhaps because we cannot know. Perhaps they would have if they'd have just petitioned God. However, here again, when they needed to trust and rely on God the most, well, here comes the same old again. Fell into the same old trap of ungratefulness and complaining. Again, you look at verse 5. What was the object of their dissension? They spoke against whom?
Against God and Moses.
Oh, God, obviously, and Moses, their favorite punching bag. And of course, if Aaron was still alive too, I would suggest they would have spake against him as well, don't you think? But again, here you have Moses. Now remember, Moses by this time he's alone in leading them. Aaron's dead, Miriam's dead, and now Moses had to bear the brunt of this yet again. And what's the reason? Why are they complaining yet again? Difficult way. And they thought they'd been brought out there to die in the wilderness.
And that bread that saved them and sustained them, they call it worthless.
Yeah, the manna from heaven. And, who was it that provided them with the manna every morning? With God, it was God. God provided their needs. Every need in the wilderness, did he not? And yet what do? They complained. Here they complained about lack of water, but again we see, they provided. And here they say they hated the manna. And the idea of loatheth here, it's the idea of miserable or viewing it as worthless or contemptible. And so, here, I find this ironic. They viewed God's provisions, what God provided them with, as worthless. Now, how sad is that? Viewing the things that God provides as worthless.
Because we are more interested in our wants than our needs.
Yeah.
God knows our needs. We know our needs.
There you go. And it's still possible today, is it not?
Well, we always have a tendency to blame somebody for our troubles that we didn't commit.
Yeah. And
In some cases.
I don't understand the journey toward this map on page 51. Don't see where they're going on either. More toward either.
It was a weird circuit they had to travel, and again, and really the map depicts their entire 40 years. So some of the time they were going in circles.
I can relate to that a little bit.
But it looks like they're only going down to the Red Sea again, and then going back up. Looks like it's more toward either than it is late now.
It certainly does. I'd have to look at some other maps for that. Because this one is a very weird laid out map here. I would suggest he still was. I would suggest he was still leading them by a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And certain.
It might be relating to this day and time, history. I don't mean to keep bringing this up. In the Korean War, the line was jagged, like it's up and down. Korea's a long peninsula, from China down where we were starting. Now, we diverted, didn't get all the way to go the easy route. We had to go strange country. All the strange, we had to
Right.
These people weren't getting shot at, they just didn't like the journey.
They didn't like the journey, and of course they also had to come up with deal with the Edomites and King Arad.
They threatened with a sword if they come through there.
Right. And it's not recorded, but it certainly would be implied that in dealing with Canaan, they rescued the captured Israelites. And I would think that would be the implication of verse number 3. By utterly destroying them, they rescued their fellow Israelites and all that.
Away from it. They couldn't go directly to it. If you run into something, just like on interstate, if you're traveling, you see a traffic jam like I've seen last week going to Chattanooga, you're going to look for another route.
Right. And that's why we're talking about sometimes in our lives you have to go backward to go forward. Sometimes you run up against a difficult situation, and sometimes you have to find a different way around. And sometimes it's sometimes it's a less direct route, and sometimes it's a more difficult route. But you got to do it, and that's true with our relationship with God. As we strive to walk by faith, and we come up against difficult situations, sometimes we have to stop, reassess, and then find a different way to get through with it. And sometimes it takes a lot longer for us to deal with it than we might expect, but it's necessary if we're going to go forward in our walk as Christians. However, here I suggest that Israel is getting stuck in the same old neutral again, are they not? They're not going forward, they're not going backward, they're just stuck here complaining. Let's look at verse 6 now. Let's look at what God does. Someone would read this verse.
So the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and many of the people of Israel died.
So God doesn't say anything here, does he? It's almost as if immediately he decides, well, I'm going to put a stop to this little rebellion. And he sends these fiery serpents. Now the idea of fiery serpents here literally means burning serpents. And they're so called from their burning or inflammatory bite, which was poisonous. And perhaps it was also because of their color, according to history. Mark in your notes Deuteronomy 8:15 and Isaiah 14:29 that the serpents that were found in this region were marked with fiery red spots and poison, and their bite produced a burning pain. And oftentimes the bite was fatal. And I read a lot of different ideas on what these serpents were. People have different ideas as to what these serpents were. And
Well, the color bronze is kind of pretty, but
yeah, it was. So the cure is sort of likened unto that brazen serpent.
What was that scripture again?
Deuteronomy 8:15 and Isaiah 14:29. That sort of talks more about. Those are two references that talk more about it that you might want to cite in your own personal study. And again, I suggest the sending of these serpents was punishment for their murmuring. Again, the book notes at the bottom of page 58 that submission to God would have spared Israel a great deal of misery, but the people seem to have a taste for rebellion. And I agree with that statement, do you not? But they sort of wanted to rebel against God. Now, what was the consequence of the bite of these fiery serpents? Many people died. And again, sin here brought physical death upon these Israelites. And wages of sin is death. And Israel found that out the hard way yet again. Now look at verse 7 now. We see the punishment. Now look at the plea. If someone would read this verse.
Therefore people come to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he taketh away these serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people.
All right, thank you, Brother Carl. Now, what did the people recognize here? In this panic, in this And again, you've got all these serpents going on, and I'm sure you've got crying and wailing going on. Now, what do the people realize here, recognize?
They sinned.
They recognize they sinned. And they even confess their sin, do they not? They confess, we've spoken against the Lord. And so they're on the right path, repentance and confession. Now, what do they desire? That Moses, again, your sister Nana, they wanted Moses to intercede on their behalf. That God would take away the serpents. Now, understanding how Moses has been treated, and we understand how angry he was with the people back in Numbers 20, how could Moses have reacted?
Because you're on your own.
Could have said, you're on your own. Or he could have said, you stiff-necked and rebellious people, you're getting what you deserve. But what does he do? He prays, he intercedes. And again, it shows further proof he bounced back from his terrible sin that we talked about a couple of weeks ago.
We are taught to pray for our enemies.
Yeah.
And
Even those who treat you spitefully.
even those that were never met who cut people's head off.
And Moses had been treated very spitefully by Israel, had he not? Now, look at what God's provision was. Someone would read now. Let's read verses 8 and 9.
Then the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And it shall be that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, shall live. So Moses made a bronze serpent and put it on a pole. And so it was, if a serpent had bitten anyone, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived.
All right, thank you, Sister Roberta. Now, we're going to have a lot more to say about these two verses here in a little bit during the worship hour. But let's notice a few things here. First, God gave Moses an instruction, did he not? What was he to do? Make a fiery, brazen, or brass serpent. And as I think you pointed out, Sister Dusty, the color would be like unto these fiery serpents. So God gives him this, and then you set it on a pole or a standard and lift it up, by which it would be easily seen. So it would, the people could easily see it, could they not? So what do we see here? God is providing what for the people? Way of escape. This is grace, is it not? Manifestation of grace. Do we deserve salvation? We don't deserve it. But yet God has provided what? A way, grace. So we see grace here. Now, look at this next portion. And again, when you talk with others, you can use this passage and, getting off a little on evangelism. Ask them this question. Was there a condition for Israel to be saved? Did Israel have to do something in order to be spared? What did they have to do?
Look at it.
They had to look upon this brazen serpent, did they not?
And believe.
Yeah,
Kind of faith.
exactly. It's an obedient faith, is it not? So what happened if I say, what would happen if they say, I believe you, God, but they didn't look on the brazen serpent? They would die.
Or they thought, well, that's just crazy.
Yeah, it's sort of like baptism today, is it not? People look at it, well, you're just crazy. No, we're not.
It's like atheism. I bet one of them that got bit did not do it.
Yeah. And
Of course, the blood on the doorpost, I always think of that.
you had to make the application.
It's just like, they didn't believe that, and those were, all what that was together, he had a purpose for it too, to overrule. Pharaoh was giving them a bad time.
Again, what happened if Israel hadn't applied the blood of the lamb to their
They
doorposts?
would have lost their firstborn, just like Pharaoh's people.
Yeah, again, you can see where we're going with this. Blood of the Passover lamb. Look upon the lifted up brazen serpent. Again, all pointing toward Christ.
That's it.
It all points toward Christ, and that's why we're going to look at it in further detail this morning in the sermon.
To get into the blood of Christ, we have to be baptized.
Exactly. Romans 6, 3 and 4. Get into Christ's death. You know, Christ put it so simple in Mark 16:16, did he not? He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. Christ didn't have to say, he that believeth not and is baptized not shall be condemned, because if you don't believe baptism is necessary for to be saved, then you don't truly believe, do you?
Either one of those steps will not get you to heaven if you don't do it.
Acts 2:38 as well. Repent. So we're not saved by one thing alone, are we? It takes everything. And certainly we see that it takes grace and it takes an obedient faith. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9. That's what it means to be saved by grace through faith. And certainly we see the submission of both. What did Moses do as God required? Verse 9. He did. And what did Israel do here as well? That if a serpent had bitten any man when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now, let's emphasize this as well. God worked the cure. God provided the cure. But Israel had to look, did they not? They had to apply the cure. So we see that, again, we emphasize salvation is by grace through faith. And that's what enables us to access that saving grace, is it not? Is our faith. And of course, Hebrews chapter 11 discusses faith, what faith actually is. And it certainly shows faith involves action on the part of man. And so here we see Israel again afflicted by God due to their sin, but yet God graciously providing them a way to be saved, and Israel taking advantage of it by looking upon the brazen serpent. Now, we come now to the last point, last part of our lesson, verses 10 through 20, and we finally see Israel going forward. They'd gotten stuck in neutral, had they not, with the murmuring here in the wilderness yet again, in the events of the fiery serpents. So let's look at Israel going forward again. If someone would, let's go ahead and read verses 10 through 20. We'll go ahead and read this whole section.
Now the children of Israel moved on and camped in Oboth. And they journeyed from Oboth and camped at Ajeberim in the wilderness which is east of Moab toward the sunrise. From there they moved and camped in the valley of Zerah. From there they moved and camped on the other side of the Arnon, which is in the wilderness that extends from the border of the Amorites, for the Arnon is the border of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. Therefore it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord, Wade in Sepha the brooks of the Arnon, and the slope of the brooks that reaches to the dwelling of Ar, and lies in the border of Moab. From there they went to Beer, which is the well where the Lord said to Moses, Gather the people together, and I will give them water. Then Israel sang this song, Spring up, O well, all of you sing to it. The well, the leaders sang, dug by the nation's nobles, by the lawgiver with their staves. And from the wilderness they went to Mattanah, and from Mattanah to Mahale, from Mahale to Bamoth, and from Bamoth in the valley that is in the country of Moab, to the top of Pisgah, which looks down on the wasteland.
Now obviously the Pisgah here is not Jackson County, Alabama. A little joke here. But here we finally see Israel progressing, going forward yet again. And you look at their trek in verses 10 through 13. Our book notes on page 59, it gives us a little hint as to their trek. tells us they moved northward from the Red Sea along the eastern edge of the Edomite lands. A wadi, or perennial stream called the Zered, dumps into the Dead or Red Sea at its southern extreme. The wadi marked the border between the Edomite lands and Moab. After a brief encampment there, Israel continued northward until the people reached another wadi, this one called the Arnon. So that gives us a little insight into their trek. Now, let's look at verses 14 through 16. And I think I'm ahead of you here, Sister Dusty. Someone might be asking, what is the book of the wars of the Lord? Now, this phrase here in verse 14, this book is in a lyrical form, and it is possible that it was a book of poetry or a hymnal. And the composition of this book, and there's so much we cannot know, and certainly our lesson book tells us that as well, but I think there's a couple of things. You know, the composition of this book must have been prior to the completion of the Pentateuch. And remember, Moses was divinely inspired to write the book of Numbers. And perhaps, let me emphasize this, perhaps this book was completed during the period of the wandering in the wilderness. Perhaps. We can't be dogmatic here. Some suggest that this book is a collection of odes of the time of Moses himself in celebration of the glorious acts of the Lord to and for the Israelites. And again, we cannot know with 100% certainty what this book is. We know we don't need it because God would have included it in His Word if we did. So we cannot be dogmatic with our view as to what it is. Certainly, it was a book that existed. We don't know exactly what it was. Some have made suggestions. That's one of them, but we don't have it. So, but needless to say, it was real. Verses 17 through 20, we have the song of praise. Remember verse 16, Moses told the people to gather together, and God told Moses to tell the people to gather together, and I, that is God, would give them water. Again, God would show that He truly did provide for them. And the word Be'er here means well of water, ironically enough. Verse 17, the purpose of this song would be an expression of faith, joy, zeal, which made memorable this desert oasis. Now look at verse 18. How was God going to provide them with water this time? Was it going to be through a rock? Got to dig a well this time. And the work was done under the direction of Moses. And what happened after they dug the well? What did they receive? They received their water. And so, once again, Israel's needs were provided for, but in a different manner this time. And so, verses 19 and 20, from here, Israel would continue their trek until they arrived at Pisgah. Now, why is this location, Pisgah, so significant? What would happen at Mount Pisgah? What's that? Moses would die there, Nebo and Pisgah. And it would be from here where Moses would look over into the Promised Land. So Numbers 21 really is a rich chapter, is it not? It gives us a lot of information regarding, and a lot of lessons to learn regarding salvation, obviously, by grace through faith, as we've talked about. And certainly that talks about the need for a strong faith in God and the need to rely upon God. And does it not show us that our journey through life isn't always going to be easy? Indeed, again. And there's going to be problems. There will be setbacks. But yet if we trust and rely upon God, hey, we'll make it through. There you go, Sister Nana. The life of faith is a forward march. Just as Israel could not reach Canaan without progress, we as Christians cannot go to heaven unless we progress in our walk as Christians. Sometimes in our journey, as we have talked about, we may have to go backward in order to go forward, as Israel literally had to, and having to turn away from Edom and take a new route. And sometimes we may have to, but we progress and overcome our obstacles by running with patience the race that is set before us. by walking by faith, by looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. So there you go. Sometimes in life, difficulties come. We go back in order to go forward.